Will you pray with me? God, may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, because you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So Paul writes to the Christians in Corinth, and here's what he wants to say. He wants to tell them about his life's work. He says, this is what I do day and night, day in and day out. I tell people about the gospel. I try to give them good news. And I deserve to be paid for that, he says. It would be fair for me to ask you to pay me for what I do. I have gone here and there and everywhere, and then back to there and back to here and back to everywhere again, founding churches, talking to you, and when I'm not with you, I write to you. All I think about all day long is telling you about the gospel, and it would be fair for me to ask you to pay me for that. But I'm not going to, he says. See, Paul doesn't want to be the employee of all. He wants to be the slave of all, he says. And that's a tricky word to use, then as now. It's a difficult word to use here in the middle of Black History Month in the United States, in Syracuse, New York, in Plymouth Church, and it was a tricky word to use back then in Corinth and in the place from which Paul was writing from, and he meant to use that word. He doesn't want to be the friend of all. He doesn't want to be the helper of all. He certainly doesn't want to be the employee of all. I want to be the slave of all and slave to the gospel, he says. He chains himself to the gospel so that he can proclaim that chains will not last forever in this world. He starves himself of his rights, he says, so that he can proclaim that one day everyone will be full and no one will be hungry. He could be so free, he could be so well paid, but he chooses to limit that freedom so that he can be a slave to the gospel. But it gets more complicated than that. He says that he's going to limit his freedom, but he also demands freedom in a certain way. He demands freedom from work so that he can answer this calling. And that's what this passage is about, I think. It's about the things we do for work and the things we do because we're called to them. And they are not always the same. Can I get an amen? Don't you get up some days and go to work? Whether you're working for money out there or whether you're retired or looking for work, don't you get up and go do whatever it is that you do every day? And don't you get sucked in and watch that big long list of emails fill your inbox? Or see that beeping light on your phone, or look at the to-do list you've made for yourself? Don't you get up and look at all that and wonder to yourself, is this what I was made for? Maybe you're lucky. Maybe you're one of those people that gets up every day and goes out to their works and says, yes, this is what I was made for. But if you are, don't tell the rest of us. We don't want to hear it. Just kidding. If you are, please tell us how to make it happen, because we're dying to know. Some of us, literally. In the midst of all those emails and in the midst of all those phone calls, in the midst of all those meetings and all those headaches and all that anxiety and all those pressures, don't you sometimes wish that the call would come so clear that you couldn't deny it? Don't you sometimes wish it would be so obvious that you could stand up from whatever you're doing, drop it, and walk out the door and know for sure that you were doing what the Creator of heaven and earth wanted you to do? It's Black History Month, and here we are in Syracuse, New York, so it's worth telling just one more time the story of the Jerry Rescue. I know most of you know this. William Henry was a freedom seeker. They called him a slave down south. They limited his freedom, but he took his freedom and he came north and he settled here in Syracuse and he became a barrel maker. And one day in 1851, in the midst of a great abolitionist gathering, a great anti-slavery rally. Federal marshals descended on Jerry's workplace. His name was William, but he called himself Jerry. Descended on Jerry's workplace and hauled him off in chains. And all the abolitionists, they were in meetings. They were sitting in places like this, listening to orators speak to them. The marshals might have gotten away with it, but for the wife of Commissioner Sabine. Commissioner Sabine is the person whose office they took Jerry to. And we presume that he knew ahead of time that this raid was going to happen. There was a law in the land at the time that even if you were in free territory, if someone could, quote unquote, prove that they, quote unquote, owned you, that you could be effectively deported back to the place from which you came. And they knew that this raid was going on. Presumably Commissioner Sabine knew it was about to happen. And for sure, almost for sure, we know that the wife of Commissioner Sabine knew it was going to happen. I don't know what her daily work was, though I have some assumptions based on her gender and the time in history that it was. But whatever her daily work was, at some point that day, she heard the gospel calling her. She heard the creator of heaven and earth singing, whispering in her ear. And so whatever it was that she was doing, she stood up and dropped it on the floor and walked out the door and told those abolitionists what was about to go down in her husband's office. And so they came, you know what happened then. They came and they broke Jerry out of Commissioner Sabine's office. They got him partway across town. He was recaptured and taken to a different place. Later that day, an even bigger crowd came and broke him out again, and this time it took. And they hid him in Syracuse for a few days, and eventually he made his way north to Canada, where he died a free man. But for those few days in Syracuse, they hid him in the home of a butcher. We know what his work was. He was a butcher, though, who was known for being against the abolitionists. He was an anti-abolitionist, loudly and publicly so. Everyone knew that he had a beef with these guys. And so there he was one day doing his work, and he heard the gospel calling. He heard the sweet voice of the creator of heaven and earth singing to him, whispering to him, and whatever he was in the midst of in that moment, he put down his tools, washed his hands, took off his apron, went to the door, opened it up, and said, "Bring that man in here." This is about work and calling, and what you do when the two don't line up. Unless you think that it's only great heroic acts that change the course of history and get written down in books, I want to tell you about something that happened in this place just about a week and a half ago. We all sat in here for the memorial service of Menno Heinrichs. And your brother and mine, George Bain, was an usher that day. I got to tell you, it feels so good to be a minister when a good usher is on the door, because we sit up there and we are trapped. And if something's going on in the back, there's almost nothing we can do without disrupting everything. So when you know there's a good usher on at the door who's going to make it their work for that hour or so to keep everything going smoothly, it feels so good. And George was on the door and we felt great. And it was partway through the service, and suddenly we heard the squeak of the outside doors open and the flood of light that always signals someone's about to come in. And I watched from where I was sitting, and no one appeared. So I realized usually that means someone's taking a while to get through the door, maybe struggling, and then eventually I saw the front nose of a stroller appear, and then the rest of a stroller, and then a woman all wrapped up against the cold. And do you know what George Bain did? He abandoned his post. He was supposed to stand there by the door and make sure nothing went wrong. And he left the sanctuary. He had to serve communion later in that service, and he took off. And he went and said, "Can I help you?" She had a 15-month-old baby with breathing problems in that stroller, and she was just moments from giving birth to another baby. She wasn't in labor, but she was close to it. And she said, is there any food here? And George did not say, come back next Thursday to the food pantry. He did tell her about the food pantry. He did not say, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. He did not say, I'm sorry, you'll have to wait until after this service was over, because he was about to serve communion here, and he knew that there was a great feast spread out in the room next door for the collation after the service. So he went down the hall and opened up that food. That food was for us. And he opened it up and he dished up a big plateful and he took it to her and he gave it to her. And she looked at him with tears in her eyes and said, you didn't judge me. And George came back into this service just in time for me to say at communion, all you have to be to eat at this table is hungry. This is about the work somebody makes us do and the calling that God hands to us. And the question is, when you get up tomorrow morning, which are you going to choose? Say amen.